So you have James Madison. James Madison, that goddamned asshole. James Madison is the president. He starts this War of 1812 with Britain and Canada. They want to go steal Canada. They want to be these imperialist bastards, right? So he starts this War of 1812. And guess what happens on August 24th, 1814? That's right, the Canadians and the British, they burnt down the White House. They burnt down the White House. We were going to invade Canada, and then they were going to welcome us as liberators. Just like the Iraq War. 1 million killed. I think it was important for the Vietnam War for the American people to see the bloody images. TV was a new medium, and so they showed the bloody images. Because I think people in America could vote for the Iraq War, be okay with 1 million people being murdered because they didn't see it, so they could deny it to themselves. They could pretend that it's not happening. And as I say that, here we see the Palestinians being fucking exterminated, being fucking killed. And in some ways, if God is just, I tremble for my country, is what Thomas Jefferson said when it came to slavery. So I just want to make a couple comments about how long it took. What did James Madison do after the White House burnt down? I mean, that's the White House. He's the fucking president. He started this War of 1812. So right before the British invaded, James Madison, the president, he fled the capital. He was overseeing military preparations. He narrowly escaped capture when British forces advanced on Washington, D.C. He fled to safety, first to Virginia and then to Maryland, to avoid being taken prisoner. He regrouped and he returned after the British withdrew from Washington on August 25th, 1814. So they only stayed a day. They came in August 24th, burned everything down. Then August 25th, they absconded. They got the hell out of Dodge. Madison returned to the city within a few days. He reconvened his government temporary quarters. The White House, other public buildings were destroyed. James Madison worked to restore government operations using private homes and temporary offices. In Washington, the government operated out of places like the Octagon House and other surviving structures. Madison issued proclamations to boost morale and condemn the British destruction. On September 1st, 1814, James Madison called for national unity and resilience, urging citizens to continue supporting the war effort. He oversaw the reconstruction plans, and he pursued diplomacy. That year, at the end of that year, December 24th, 1814, is going to be the Treaty of Ghent, which is going to bring about peace, not in the Middle East, but on the American continent. And news of the treaty reached the U.S. in early 1815, bolstering Madison's leadership, but not before Andrew Jackson fought the Battle of New Orleans. After the war was over. The war is over, but the Battle of New Orleans happens anyways. So August 24th, 1814, the British burned down our White House. Then September, October, November, December, we sue for peace, status quo. We sue for peace, and it's called status quo antebellum, which means let's just go back to the way things were before. Let's go back to the way things were before. So we gain nothing. All that bloodshed, all that loss of life, all that treasure. Tecumseh's going to get murdered. So I was just interested in Madison's plight. He's going to go to Virginia, then he's going to go to Maryland. When he's in Virginia, he goes to Wiley's Tavern, Great Falls, Virginia, then to Salona, McLean, Virginia, then to Brookville, Montgomery County, Maryland, and then some other Maryland locations as well. James Madison was concerned for his wife, Dolly Madison, because Dolly Madison had fled separately from James. But she made sure that she grabbed the portrait of George Washington before they burnt down the White House. Apparently, he stayed at the home of the Reverend William Maffett. So while the British is burning down the White House, he's just kind of galloping on his horse all over the place. Or maybe he's being escorted by horse and buggy. He returned to Washington, D.C. August 28th. So he was only gone for 4 days. Once it was absolutely clear that the British was gone. I'm not going back. Not until you tell me that they've gone. They already left, sir. They've been gone for 3 days. Dolly Madison, she went to Virginia and Maryland as well, and then she returned to Washington, D.C. with James Madison, August 28th, 1814. So they went back to Washington, D.C., and they stayed at the Octagon House, not the White House. Do I have any other questions? Let's see. Let's see here. What other structures in D.C. did the British burn down in 1814? So the British didn't just burn down the White House, but they also burnt down the U.S. Capitol. It was still under construction. It was set ablaze. Much of the interior was destroyed, including the Library of Congress. All those papers with the pilgrims and whatnot. The Supreme Court chamber was burnt down, and the Senate and the House wings. The stone walls largely survived, but the wooden interiors was all burnt. The Treasury building was burnt down. It was located near the White House, the Treasury building. So that's where we were printing money or something, or coining gold and silver, destroying financial records. The War Department and the State Department buildings were burnt down. They housed military and diplomatic records. They were set on fire. Some of the records were saved by the clerks. The Navy Yard, the Washington Navy Yard, was partially burned by the British. But the American forces actually set fire to the Navy Yard. We burned our own Navy Yard. Why? Because we didn't want our ships and supplies and our munitions. So we burnt down all of our firepower and the ships and supplies in the Navy Yard. USS Columbia and other materials were destroyed. The President's Square barracks and other military structures. British forces targeted military facilities, including the barracks and storehouses around President's Square, now Lafayette Square, burning several smaller structures. The Patent Office. was partially spared. Located in Blodgett's Hotel, was initially targeted but spared after Dr. William Thornton, the superintendent, convinced British officers of its cultural and scientific value. Nearby buildings were damaged. Other public and private buildings, the British set fire to additional structures, including the office of the National Intelligencer, a newspaper critical of the British, which was deliberately targeted. Some private homes and businesses near public buildings were also damaged, though the British focused primarily on government targets. The British spared most private property, focusing on symbols of government authority. For example, homes like the Octagon House and the Dumbarton House were not burned. The destruction was halted partly by a sudden storm on August 25th, which helped to extinguish the fires and prompted the British to withdraw. So thank God for the storm, right? If it wasn't for the storms, the destruction was halted by the storm. Reconstruction of these buildings began after the war, with the Capitol and the White House taking years to fully restore. This targeted destruction aimed to humiliate and destabilize the U.S. government, but ultimately galvanized American resolve to rebuild. I don't know. I'm still kind of embarrassed about it today. We didn't side with the French Revolutionary Forces. We didn't cut the umbilical cord. We had to stay tied to the damn mother country. And what did we get by staying tethered? What did we get staying bridled and tethered to our mother country? We got our fucking White House burnt down. They were impressing our sailors. That was like a big thing too. So the British had this big navy, and they weren't allowing our navy to go around doing any trade, and they kept on stealing our ships and then forcing American sailors to fight in the British Royal Army. And who is the king? Was that still King George III? Who was king of Britain in 1814? Yeah, King George III, same motherfucking goddamn asshole that we had. Why would we be trading with these motherfuckers? Why would we be friendly to these guys? John Adams famously goes and kisses King George's ass. They said that he was incapacitated due to mental illness, likely porphyria. So he was incapacitated due to porphyria, I don't know, P-H-Y-R, porphyria. I'm sorry, but the king, the guy who runs us all, he's suffering from mental illness right now. And he was deemed unfit to rule. As a result, his son, George, the Prince of Wales, acted as regent, effectively governing as Prince Regent under the Regency Act of 1811. He later became King George IV upon his father's death in 1820. So that's trippy, huh? So I guess it was King George IV, technically. Both of the fucking Georges. Could the War of 1812 have been avoided? Impressment of American sailors were less critical as the Napoleonic Wars neared their end. Had the British stopped impressing our sailors, that could have diffused American anger. Americans could have pursued a more robust diplomacy, such as offering to verify sailors' citizenship to address British concerns about deserters, repeal of trade restrictions, so they repealed the orders in council just 2 days before the U.S. declared war. So they were restricting our trade, but 2 days before we declared the war, they stopped the trade restrictions. So trade restrictions, that's like a tariff, huh? So we were pissed off at the tariffs. So British impressment of American sailors, trade restrictions and orders in council, British support for Native American tribes, expansionist ambitions, U.S. war hawks want to annex Canada, expand American territory, maritime and national order. Yeah, Henry Clay was all about this damn war. Yeah, America could have integrated with the Native Americans instead of murdering them and stealing all their land. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun were some war hawks. 60% of all the people who died in the War of 1812 were Kentuckians. A lot of the counties of Kentucky are named for the fallen generals who marched up to Detroit and got pummeled. The battle for Detroit was, I want to say it was a loss. Overall, the war was status quo antebellum, so would we get respect? So Madison, he got a war declaration partly because of politics. Madison wanted to unify his party and counter Federalist opposition. So that was the Democratic Republicans. How come we never had any Federalists? It was just George Washington, John Adams, and then we never had Federalists after that again? What happened to the Whigs and the Federalists? So because of terrible communication and terrible time, the timing was all wrong, and we didn't have good communication. Hey, we got to go to war. Why? They keep restricting our trade. Well, if we got to do it, we got to do it. Hey, wait a second, Mr. President. They lifted the trade restrictions 2 days ago. And then there was communication problems with the Battle of New Orleans. And then that was the rise of Andrew Jackson. So thanks a lot, fucking James Madison. He's the 4th president. But then we're going to see Andrew Jackson rise through the ranks because he was the general. Then actually Andrew Jackson issued that famous quote about a bunch of Kentuckians were, I don't know if they were impressed or if they were forced. So are they being drafted? So we're talking about the British essentially drafting our men into their Royal Army, and then we started drafting men. What did America have a draft for the War of 1812? We did not have a national draft for the War of 1812. Military service during the war was primarily based on volunteer enlistments and state militias, with no centralized conscription system like those seen in later conflicts, such as the Civil War or World War I. Below is or Vietnam. Below is a concise overview. You had a volunteer regular army. Congress expanded the size of the army, authorizing an increase to about 35,000 regular troops, but recruitment often fell short due to low pay, harsh conditions, and competition with militias. Enlistment bounties, cash incentives, and promises of land were used to attract volunteers, but the regular army remained under strength throughout the war. Madison actually said that the militias were crap and that we needed a professional army, which was incredible because during the constitutional era, we were against standing armies because standing armies were a threat to tyranny. But then Hamilton says, well, we need to be respected throughout the world, so we're going to need a standing army. So it'd be nice to think that, Israel, there in Switzerland, I think there's other countries out there that make every person or every man fight in the military for so long. It's like if you're born in the country, then you're a military man. And I wouldn't hate that idea. We got the Second Amendment, right? So if we got used to each other having guns, forming militias. Militias used to be a big thing in the beginning of the country. They're not as big now, but I'm sure there are some militias. The bulk of the U.S. forces came from state militias. So I guess the militias weren't people militias. They weren't the people's militias. They were state militias. They weren't like rainbow people rainbow militias. They were composed of citizen soldiers organized and funded by individual states. These militias were called into federal service by James Madison or the state governors to defend local areas or participate in campaigns. Militia service was generally voluntary, though some states had laws requiring able-bodied men, typically age 18 to 45, to enroll in militia units and train periodically. During the war, governors could mobilize these units for short-term service, often 3 to 6 months. Militia participation varied widely. Some units refused to serve outside their state or in offensive campaigns, such as invading Canada, citing constitutional limits on militia use, which created challenges for coordinated military efforts. The federal government did not implement a national conscription system. Proposals for a draft were discussed late in the war, particularly in 1814 when the U.S. faced military setbacks and manpower shortages. In December 1814, Secretary of War James Monroe proposed a plan to conscript 40,000 men to bolster the army. This was met with fierce opposition in Congress, particularly from Federalists. Some Republicans who argued that it violated individual liberties and state sovereignty. The plan was never enacted as the war ended shortly after with the Treaty of Ghent, December 1814. I want to say December 25th, wasn't it Christmas? And then it was ratified February 8, 1815. So maybe the Battle of New Orleans didn't happen after the end of the war because the Treaty of Ghent wasn't ratified until February. So I'm wondering which American states required able-bodied men to enroll in militia units in 1814. Most American states had laws requiring able-bodied men to enroll in militia units. So we didn't have a national draft, but it seems like we had a state draft. All these states were drafting the militia. It's a practice rooted in colonial traditions and the early American emphasis on decentralized defense. These laws typically mandated that men aged 18 to 45 register with local militia units, participate in periodic training or muster days. However, the specifics of enforcement, exemptions, and obligations varied by state, and not all states uniformly enforced those requirements during the war. Below is an overview based on historical militia systems and their application in 1814. Wow, they go through each one of the states too. The Militia Acts of 1792, passed by Congress, established a federal framework requiring all free, able-bodied white male citizens 18 to 45 to enroll in their state's militia, own a firearm, and be available for service. States were responsible for organizing and regulating their militias, leading to variations in implementation. So Andrew Jackson goes to New Orleans. The British are going to invade New Orleans, so he rushes to go to New Orleans, and then a bunch of Kentuckians show up, and they were undersupplied. Andrew Jackson said he never met a Kentuckian who didn't have a gun, deck of cards, and a flask of whiskey on them a day in his life. So, states with mandatory militia enrollment in 1814: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana. Kentucky's militia law mandated enrollment for able-bodied men, and the state's militia was heavily involved in the Northwest campaigns against British and Native American forces. Enthusiasm for the war was high, but enrollment remained compulsory. So that is like a draft. All the states had drafts, right? Not a national draft, but all the states. Clergy, doctors, Quakers, physical disabled, they were allowed to exempt themselves. Massachusetts and Connecticut were less cooperative with federal militia calls due to the Federalist opposition to the war. Territories like Indiana, Illinois, and Mississippi also had militia systems with mandatory enrollment. How many Americans died in the War of 1812? Which state had the most casualties? So about 15,000 to 20,000 Americans died during the War of 1812. Over 2,000 American soldiers were killed in battle, but most Americans were killed in non-combat deaths. About 12 to 17,000 Americans had died from disease, malnutrition, exposure, and poor medical care, which were rampant in camps and among troops. Common causes were dysentery, typhoid, and infections. Fucking Henry Clay. The states with the most casualties, there's no precise state-by-state breakdown of casualties for the War of 1812. It says New York is the most likely state to have had the highest casualties. Due to its significant involvement in the war, New York's strategic location along the Canadian border made it a major theater of conflict. Key battles such as the Battle of Plattsburgh, the Niagara Campaign, battles of Lundy's Lane and Fort Erie, and earlier engagements, Battle of Queenston Heights, 1812. New York contributed large numbers of militia and regular troops, and its proximity to British forces in Canada led to sustained military activity. Other contenders besides New York: Maryland, Tennessee, Texas, or Kentucky, Maryland, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. So the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tennessee and Kentucky helped. The Battle of New Orleans, Tennessee and Kentucky helped. Tennessee under Andrew Jackson and Kentucky sent large militia forces, with Kentucky reportedly suffering high losses in battles like the River Raisin Massacre of 1813. Their total casualties likely fell below New York's due to fewer sustained campaigns. As a frontier state, Ohio's militia was active against British and Native American forces in the Northwest. Fort Meade's disease and combat losses were significant. Maryland saw significant action, particularly during the British Chesapeake Campaign of 1814, including the Battle of Bladensburg and the defense of Baltimore, Fort McHenry. That's when our national anthem was written. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed by the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars in the peril and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof to the night that our flags were still there. Oh, hey, as a star-spangled ever wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave. Fucking Henry Clay. What an asshole. Did Henry Clay own slaves? Yes, Henry Clay owned slaves. He was born in Virginia, moved to Kentucky, became a successful lawyer and politician. He owned a large estate called Ashland in Lexington, which relied on enslaved labor for its operations, including farming and household work. So at various points, Henry Clay owned between 20 to 60 enslaved people, with the numbers fluctuating. 1830s and 1840s, Henry Clay held around 40 to 50 enslaved human beings at Ashland. Did James Madison own slaves? Yes, James Madison owned slaves. Jesus Christ. The fourth president of the U.S., key figure of the War of 1812, Madison was a lifelong slaveholder consistent with the practices of many wealthy Virginia planters of his era. He owned approximately 100 to 120 enslaved people at Mount Pelier during his lifetime. His primary estate was Mount Pelier in Orange County, Virginia. He owned men, women, and children who worked as field hands, domestic servants, and skilled laborers such as carpenters and blacksmiths. Some slaves accompanied him to Washington, D.C. Madison had slaves in Washington, D.C. He did not free his slaves. When he died, he didn't free his slaves during his lifetime, nor retirement, nor after he died. In his will, he left the enslaved people to his wife, Dolly Madison. No provision for their emancipation. He died in 1836. Madison helped shape compromises that protected slavery, such as the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause. He owned 100 to 120 slaves. What the fuck? Well, we aren't told about that now, are we? Did John Adams own slaves? No, John Adams did not own slaves. He was a staunch opponent of slavery. They had paid labor. Abigail Adams was also against slavery. Did James Monroe own slaves? Yes, James Monroe owned slaves too. God damn. He owned from 75 to 250 enslaved people over the course of his life. In Highland. All right, so that's enough of that.